Blessings 6. Still awake, Gwyneth? Mrs. Celestine asked softly as she fed another bundle of sticks to our fire. There was a moment of quiet as I debated whether to reply. Yes, I answered mulously, rolling over and turning away from her. I missed Mama. I hadn't slept well the night of my birthday before we left. Despite pleading, begging and even starting to cry, Mama wouldn't explain what was wrong. The distance that I thought had started to close had snapped back open and now was a yawning void. But even when I said I didn't want to go, to leave Mama as she was, she and Mr. Celestine made sure I had. So here we were, 4 days into our cold and soggy trip down towards the Blackwald. Riding Hazel wasn't much fun. The short trips to nearby Farmstead or Kiel Harbor hadn't been so bad, but they had been short. The saddle sores couldn't be healed away until we stopped, and we were riding for hours and hours each day. Then you can tell me what constellations you see tonight, she ordered. She'd asked it every single night, and sure she was teaching me new ones each time, but it was irritating. Raven, bear, mammoth, I said without bothering to look up. I knew that wouldn't be enough. The seasonal signs or the zodiac were obvious ones. Grumbling to myself, I sat up, glaring at the sky and pointing more out in turn. Twin hunters, whining serpents, and between the branches of that tree is the starhammer. Without another word, I dropped back into my blanket and pulled him over myself. The fire crackled as it was stirred gently, the only response to my snappish answer a long and frustrated sigh. I didn't sleep well that night either, like the ones before it. Worries about my mother plaguing my mind, finding it hard to sleep without her there. Mr. Celestine didn't know the stories we used to tell one another, didn't know how he made our camp, didn't have us share blankets and warmth. Everything was wrong, and I was scared nothing was going to be any better when we went home. The next few days weren't any different. Mr. Celestine trying to engage me with a lesson, teaching me herb lore, as if Mama had neglected that, and knew all the plans she pointed out already, and making me memorize more and more constellations. At points I was tempted to just ignore her, to block her out and resent her for forcing me to come, but I knew why I was upset, why I was angry. It didn't stop me being upset or angry, but it wasn't her fault. It wasn't anyone's fault. I missed Mama. In my head, I knew I shouldn't be so fixated, so dependent on her, that it wasn't healthy. But she had been there from the first thing I could remember in this world. The one constant as everything else changed. When I had realized I was on Azeroth and was scared, terrified of the nightmare monsters, the demonic hordes, she was the one to comfort me, to hold me in her arms and sing me to sleep. If Mama hadn't loved me so much, and made me love her in turn, I probably would have hid from everything. But she taught me why we should care for those who were afraid of us, who viewed us with suspicion. But even if they weren't the most respectful or kind, they were still people and deserved to be helped. I was attached, and I didn't regret becoming attached one bit, but I hated how much it was hurting to be away from her. Rather than following the Northgate River and the main road that ran nearby to Gunlea City, Mr. Celestine turned us southwards, following the road towards Stormglen, past Edric's Repose. There were plenty of villages and small towns dotting the path we took, but other than the times we arrived shortly before dusk or the horses were winded, we didn't stop in them. A stark difference from with Mama. Every town, every village, Mama had checked to see if there was something needing to be done, and staying a day or two to see that it was. With Mr. Celestine we barely stayed the night, and it all blurred together. Houses besides the roads but the names, people, signs, the history and heritage, all of it was just ignored. As the edge of the Blackwald looked on the horizon, I knew it had gotten us here faster, but I couldn't help but feel reminded of the stagecoach ride to Lord Crendon's estate. There was no substance to the journey. It wasn't traveling to find something, it was just traveling to get somewhere. I knew the dislike I felt toward Mr. Celestine for that was stupid and petty, but just like everything else, I couldn't stop myself feeling it. When we finally stopped, camping at the edge of the forest, I finally asked the question that had been stewing in my mind for 2 weeks. Why couldn't Mama come with us? Mistress Celestine didn't react, merely looking out towards the forest that stretched farther than the eye could see. I grit my teeth, glowering angrily. I hadn't calmed down at all over the trip. Each little thing reminding me that Mama wasn't here, that Mistress Celestine did things differently. She was the stronger witch, but after seeing how she traveled, I felt Mama was the better one, better at helping the people who needed it most. It wasn't fair to her. We were going somewhere, unlike with Mama where we had just been traveling and didn't have a time limit or real destination. But it didn't feel like being fair. We will be stabling Sable and Hazel in the Bleak Grove tomorrow, she eventually said, as if I hadn't asked her a question. We will be traveling the rest of the way on foot. Gwyneth, you will have to follow my instructions exactly. Until you have finished your apprenticeship, you will not be told or allowed to learn where we meet. Her eyes were sharp as she turned to me. The witch hunts may have ended, but there are still some of us alive who remember the stories of their grandparents. What happened in the name of rooting out shadows 6 generations ago. And? What does it have to do with Mama not coming? She should have. She said she couldn't. I begged her to. I squeezed my eyes tight. I didn't want to cry. I didn't. No one who is not a full member of the Coven is allowed to know where we meet, Mr. Celestine said, repeating what she said before with barely any different words. Only apprentices are guided in, confused and misled to not know where they are going. Your mother never finished hers. She is barred from the sacred ground until she is ready for the final trial. And Gwyneth, for all I care for my cousin, she is not ready. Mr. Celestine put a hand on my back and began rubbing circles onto it. She does not believe herself ready, and though I could lie, I will not. I do not either. Not in mind, not in spirit, not in magic nor body. I would not be her sponsor for the rite, nor her old teacher. And there are no others. She could not follow us into the forest. Tears made it difficult to see as I looked up at Mr. Celestine, but I saw on her face the same thing I saw when she was looking at Emmeline. I miss her, I cried, breaking out into childish sobs. She pulled me against her side and let me cry. She wasn't Mama. Mama wasn't here. But at least I finally let myself cry. Bleak Grove wasn't much of a village. A small Passover village built around the coaching house that made up part of the route down to Stormglen. The dark black-walled oak that made up most of the village buildings lent the place a dark air even during the day. But despite that, the people were still cheerful, well-fed and cared for. And in contrast to its name, the village was surrounded by well-tended and maintained orchards. I thought I could feel the work of another witch on them, and signs of their residence in the village, or at least nearby. But with it being winter, it was hard to be sure. We left Hazel and Maple at the coaching inn. The proprietor seemed familiar with the affair, greeting Mr. Celestine by name as we had a short meal in the warmth before moving on into the forest itself. It's dark, I said, stating my first impression as we entered the forest. The sun had swiftly retreated between the interlocking branches of the trees, which even without leaves seemed determined to deny the forest floor its light. Maybe in the height of day there would be light and shadows dancing upon the snow-covered ground, but with the morning sun low in the sky it was still gloomy and dark. But it doesn't feel scary? The forest knows us, Mr. Celestine said, pulling a small lantern out of her pack and lighting it. Our kin have been coming here since before there was a kingdom. This old forest has long had a chance to come to terms with those like us. Even so, there are still dangers here. Be wary and stay in the light. Even in the shadowy dim light beneath the branches, there was undergrowth. Thick brambles surrounding the well-trodden path we were taking into the woods proper. There had to be an absurd amount of berries in the summer with the sheer amount of them that lay in the outer reaches of the woods, though I wasn't sure I'd like to try tackling them to get at the sweet berries with how some of the thorns looked. None were as big as my arms, but ones as big as my fingers came up often enough to be concerning. A normal bramble thicket was spiky enough. I knew this from experience twice over. These were overdoing it. Though the trees were gnarled and twisted, bent around and hardly ever growing straight, I didn't feel anything wrong with them. The black bark and dark wood were daunting, foreboding, and lent our walk an ominous air, but there was no cruelty, no malice. The forest was alive and aware, even more than Celestine's little grove had been, and so very, very wild. The branches shifted in the wind, as if hiding things from sight, or hiding us from sight. The very boughs of the trees were secretive and only tolerated our intrusion. They did not welcome it. Despite that sense of secrecy, I still felt eyes upon us. The first night in the woods, with a carefully kept fire to keep us warm made solely of dead fallen wood, I had trouble sleeping due to that sense of being watched. The quiet crackling of the dimmed ashes of the fire the only sound in the night. My mind had worried over spiders, the same ones Songbang got the silk they spun from. I wasn't truly arachnophobic, but that didn't mean the idea of giant spiders didn't terrify me. But eventually, my eyes settled on beady reflections in the branches of the trees, and after a few heart-stopping moments of fear, I made out the form of birds, a tree of ravens watching us from the branches of the trees, their black eyes reflecting the embers of our dwindling fire. It was days later and late evening that we came across a lodge hidden in the forest. A well-built home in a typical tall-roofed Ghanaian style, standing at the edge of a cliff, clinging the narrow strip of open space and clear skies offered by the precipice. While there were some small gardens marked out with fences, there weren't enough to feed even a single man. It had to be a hunting lodge. A man dressed warmly for winter spotted us as we walked up and along the dirt trail towards his abode. He nodded his head in acknowledgement before returning to his whittling. "Fair days, Roland," Mr. Celestine called out as we approached. "Might we rest by your hearth for a time?" "Fair days indeed, Lady Celestine," Roland answered, not looking up from his whittling. "I suppose there's space for two. A warm fire and good meal will do a child good as the days grow colder." "Thank you, sir," I said appreciatively. The weather had turned for the worse again not long after we entered the forest. The initial light dusting of snow was now several inches thick, and while Mr. Celestine was tall enough to march through it with little trouble, I was finding it harder to keep going. Even with my new boots, warm and good at keeping the snow out as they were, my small stature was becoming an irritation. Not that I was in danger of freezing. I was beginning to suspect there had to be some measure of magic in the cloak Mama had bought me from Mrs. Tilda's store. It never seemed to get cold, even when it was pressed up against the snow. Or had been left without a source of heat in this weather. It was also proving to be remarkably difficult, not that I was actually trying, to get the full outfit dirty. "Head on in and start the fire, Gwyneth," Mr. Celestine told me. "I have a few things to speak of with Roland. We'll take supper soon." I nodded and went inside, and soon the warmth and shelter made me feel comfortable enough to doze. It was the first time since entering the woods I hadn't felt like I was being watched. All of that, combined with a deliciously fishy dinner, made by Roland, meant when it was time to curl up and sleep, it came quickly and deeply. When I woke slowly, groggily, like someone had stuffed wool into my head and left it there. It was a struggle to force my eyes open. The most obvious thing I found was that we weren't at the lodge, we weren't anywhere near it. Though everything felt dulled and blurry, I could still tell that we were somehow even deeper into the forest. I slurred, my mouth dry and tongue awkward. "Give it a few minutes, the antidote won't take long." Antidote? My head felt wrong. It was a struggle to think. But the symptoms... It was the same as the mellowgrass sedative Mama had taught me to make. A painkiller and soporific. Made waking up miserable, but it put you to sleep safely enough and kept you that way. "Why?" I forced out. I was angry again. I had barely gotten over feeling resentful for being separated from Mama, and she did this? "No one who isn't a full member of the coven can know where they meet, Gwyneth." A hand stroked my hair, but I tried to bat it away. She drugged me! I didn't want her comforting me! "You were asleep long enough that any path you might think you knew is muddled. Roland has helped with this since I was a little girl, since old Grimm's took me here. You know what I used. It didn't harm you at all. Could have asked. Did she think it happening to her made it okay? If she'd said anything, I probably would have agreed. I knew the doses. Mellowgrass was a sleeping aid as much as a painkiller. And if it was addictive, I'd never heard a story of it happening. It was safe. But it didn't mean I was okay with being drugged by someone I trusted without being told anything. You... My tongue was clear, the feeling of numbness fading. A fractional dose of Goldthorn tonic would serve as an antidote. It was just working faster than expected. You could have told me! I would have agreed! You didn't... You shouldn't... How could you just drug me? I trusted you! I was screaming at the end, breaking the quiet of the forest, standing and heaving as I shook off the last of the grogginess. You were supposed to take care of me! Gwyneth, she said calmly. No! Why? I can understand it! I get it! Secret meetings have to stay safe! I didn't reach the upper echelons of my voice often, rarely feeling the need to screech, and the sound echoed in the woods somehow. But you can't! Gwyneth, silence! Celestine snapped, any patience worn out. You will not raise your voice any further or you endanger us both! My eyes remained fixed on her. No! I screamed. She drugged me! Why would I shut up and let her get away with it? Tell me why! Celestine glowered at me, gritting her teeth. I do as we have always done, nothing more. Your mother went through the same. She said in a hushed whisper. Now lower your voice! Just because it's tradition doesn't mean it's right! How did you feel when it happened to you? I said hotly. Her attention drifted, looking out into the trees, and a look of deep concern crossed her face. Upset, I cried. Old Grimms was never kind. Clever and a good teacher, but not kind. She would give you the cane for this outburst. Celestine loomed over me, reminding me of my status as a child. I thought you were wise enough to understand why. I see that I was wrong. The words stung. I wasn't treated like other children my age were, and certainly not like kids before were treated. Celestine and Robin acted like I was a little adult most of the time, and Mama trusted me. A shift, her looming, frustrated and disappointed glare cut into me. But it didn't cut through my anger at being violated. I do understand why! I do not understand why you thought it had to be a secret! Gwyneth! She hissed. Quiet! Now! The force has changed since I was last here and we have strayed closer to a place of danger than I thought. She looked into the dark woods, moving to douse the embers of our fire pit with dirt. We were safe before your tantrum. I tried to protest. It wasn't a tantrum. I wasn't throwing things. It was a well-justified disagreement on how I was treated. But she barreled over me. Now we need to move. Danger is approaching and Erwin would never forgive me, nor would I forgive myself if the worst came to pass. For a few moments I wanted to keep arguing, to ignore her attempts at deflection, to scream at her to listen to me. But the part of me that listened to nature, the whispers on the wind, caught on to the same thing she had. Something was moving our way and the forest did not like it. We're not done, I spat as I shouldered my pack from where she had put it. There was still snow on the ground. Moving wasn't going to be easy for me, but I was not going to stick around to meet whatever was coming. Probably a giant spider. Sodding giant spiders. Only waiting for a direction, I stomped on ahead, not paying any heed to the amount of effort I was putting into forging my own way through the snow that came past my ankles, rather than trailing in Celestine's footsteps. Gwen! She put a hand on my shoulder, but I shrugged it off, speeding up and gaining more distance. Very well, she muttered. Celestine made no more effort to speak with me save to correct our course. How she knew the way, what method she was using to track our position and where we needed to go, I had no idea. There was no forest path anymore, no trail used by hunters, just snow-covered ground and the dark trees casting their shadows all around us. Less than an hour after our fight, I was still seething, not willing to let go of my anger in the slightest, when I was startled by the cawing of ravens. Celestine reacted differently, suddenly barking out an order. "Gwen, to your left, now!" Confused, I paused, turned to look at her rather than obeying immediately. With a curse, Celestine stopped, grabbing my shoulders and throwing me to the side as she moved the other way. Half a second later, exactly like I imagined except worse in every way, a giant spider dropped onto where I had been standing. "Widow's brood," Celestine spat, thrusting her hand into the soil. "This forest is not your friend, even as you make it your home." I had never thought I would hear a spider screech, but it did. Its spindly legs pumping and its giant bulbous thorax, larger than me, bouncing as it sprinted towards Celestine. I was frozen in place, staring at where it landed in the spot I had been, and the drops burning in the snow where venom had spilled from its fangs. As the spider closed on Celestine, a massive limb, part of one of the great oaks that made up the black vault, creaked, bending down and swatting the spider before it could reach her, animated and moving under the will of Celestine's magic. And as I watched, I saw her chest heave, the exertion and cost of mana taking its toll. I swallowed in fear. It was just a spider. A very, very big spider, but just a spider. It couldn't survive that, right? As it landed, slipping suddenly on the snow-covered ground before hissing again, I knew I was wrong. None of the magic I knew was for fighting. I had zero knowledge of how to fight. Not with sticks, not with the knife I had for utility, not with my magic. But Celestine did. The great limb of the dark oak tree still hung low, and she grasped one of its smaller branches, the wood shifting and bending until it came free. "I thank you for this gift, and shall rid one of the menaces spawn in turn," she uttered, eyes distant as she paid no heed to the spider once again careening towards her. Just before it arrived, she snapped the makeshift staff forward, knocking the spider's lunge and driving it into the soil. Vines and roots lashed out of the wood and ground, holding it in place. Then once again the great limb of the tree crashed down, and held its place as there was nothing that remained of the spider except a bloody and gooey smear on the ground. "Gwyneth," she said, "we need to go." Scrambling to my feet, I dashed around the tree, clinging to her side. "I'm sorry, No," Celestine said, starting us walking. "No, I was wrong. As you said, I should have told you. I know you. You are clever. You understand so much more than I did when I was your age. You would have understood. Instead, I betrayed your trust and you were angry. I did your body no harm, but your mind. It hurt." She nodded. "I'm glad you are safe, Gwen. Truly, For a moment she seemed as if she was going to say something else, but she shook her head. "No, this is not my secret to tell, and I made a promise." "What kind of promise?" I asked, looking up at my teacher. She was still my teacher, even if it hurt, her doing that. But I did understand why. She apologized. She did not mean to hurt me. That would have to be enough. I wasn't going to forget, not anytime soon. But after my brush with outright terror, clinging onto the anger wasn't possible anymore. One that I quickly came to regret, and only regret more so now. It wasn't a satisfying answer, but after the adrenaline rush and the crash of the spider, I was happy to leave it be, moving in silence until we were far, far away from the widow's lair.